The Boy in the Striped Pajamas is a Holocaust fiction novel written in 2006 by author John Boyne. It's about a 9-year-old kid, Bruno, who moves to Auschwitz with his Nazi commandant father. While living by the concentration camp, Bruno befriends a young Jewish boy, Shmuel, who is held captive on the other side of the fence. In the last few pages of the book, Bruno breaks into Auschwitz. Once there, he's immediately mistaken for a Jew, and he and his friend are both promptly murdered in the gas chambers. The Boy in the Striped Pajamas was massively successful. It sold over 11 million copies, been translated into 58 languages. It was adapted into an extremely successful movie and a ballet. And both the book and the movie, I don't know about the ballet, have seen much play in classrooms. According to one study from the Center for Holocaust Education, in 2016, 35% of UK classrooms were using some form of the text. So looking at all that, you're probably thinking, wow, this book sounds awesome. Heartfelt message, tragic ending, everyone must love it. But not so fast, guys, chill out a little bit, because the book, in the last 5 years, has faced a lot of controversy. In 2020, the Auschwitz Foundation responded to a tweet from Boyne saying, "The Boy in the Striped Pajamas should be avoided by anybody who studies or teaches about the history of the Holocaust." And they linked an article on that subject from the Holocaust Center. And they doubled down on that opinion 2 years later, tweeting another article from The Guardian. Pretty intense words there. The argument from the Auschwitz Foundation, the main source of the book's controversy, comes down to a few pretty basic points. First, the novel is filled with historical inaccuracies. It pervades the fiction that most Nazis were unaware of the Holocaust and presents an extremely implausible scenario, a random Jewish boy just hanging out in Auschwitz, ready and able to make friends with people outside the camps. Second, the book calls on us to empathize with Nazis over the Jews that they persecuted. In the final pages of the novel, we're meant to feel particularly bad that Bruno, our protagonist, dies in the gas chambers. But of course, no Nazi children did die in the gas chambers, just a whole lot of Jewish ones, and so you could say that the tragedy of the novel is tone deaf, doesn't give enough compassion to the actual victims of Hitler's final solution. Third, because of those first 2 points, the book does some, active harm, particularly to the young people who read it in school. In that Center for Holocaust Education report, they conducted a focus group with kids who read the book or saw the movie, and they seem to be taking some pretty bad lessons from it. Well, we always think of the Nazis as the bad guys, and this shows that the Holocaust didn't just affect the Jews, said a 9-year-old. I feel sorry for practically everyone who was under Hitler's control, and it doesn't matter who was the bigger victim. They were all still victims of Hitler's control in some shape or form, says an 11-year-old. Could we please just stop with the oppression Olympics about the Holocaust? It's because of criticisms like this that I find the title for this video fair. Are there kids' books that are less appreciated, that people find more annoying? I mean, yeah, probably, but I'm at a loss trying to come up with a book as influential as The Boy in the Striped Pajamas that is so hated. Not hated for aesthetic reasons, not because it's a bad book, but because it's seen as harmful, immoral, a detriment to the people who read it, and an insult to the subject it's about. John Boyne does not appreciate the criticism. For one thing, he thinks it's all politically motivated, woke bullshit. In the years after writing The Boy in the Striped Pajamas, Boyne has taken on quite a transphobic tone. He wrote a silly article about how he doesn't like to be called cis. He tweeted in support of J.K. Rowling, called himself a fellow TERF, and seemingly got a nice din-din with her. He, a gay man, has spoken about not wanting to associate gay rights with trans rights.
As a gay man, my views on LGBT rights and my views on the whole LGBT idea, the concept, of intertwining these two things which have no connection to each other whatsoever.
To cut a long story short, stuff like this led to much hatred and anger, and from Boyne's perspective, the backlash to The Boy in the Striped Pajamas is entirely motivated by that anger.
My theory isn't that a lot of it had to do with it. My theory is that all of it had to do with it. 100%. Absolutely.
But to drag such a beloved book into such a toxic argument, and that's just...
Look, I could be wrong.
Still, that's not all Boyne says. When he's asked specifically about what the Holocaust Foundation said, he usually takes a different tack.
Firstly, I think it's important to clarify what the Auschwitz Memorial said.
Okay.
What they said was that it shouldn't be used as a teaching tool
for those studying or learning about the Holocaust. Now, I'm a novelist. I didn't write a school book or a textbook or a university novel. I wrote just a novel, a fable.
See, guys, nobody hates the novel. Auschwitz didn't mean anything nasty when they said that the book should be avoided by anybody who studies the Holocaust. They're just saying, don't teach it in school. And that's fair enough, because The Boy in the Striped Pajamas isn't a textbook. It's a fable. It's like Animal Farm.
And they've never actually commented on the novel itself, just the teaching of it. And I think it's a reasonable point. I think if you are going to study the Holocaust, I don't necessarily think Boy in the Striped Pajamas is your starting point, any more than Animal Farm would be your starting point for the Russian Revolution, but it might be a good ancillary book.
So does this argument make sense? No, not really. For one thing, I think fables can obviously say false things, right? Like, sure, Animal Farm is a fable, but it does make claims, right? It conveys information and ideas about Stalin and Lenin and Trotsky and the fate of the Russian Revolution.
Soon or late the day will be when man's defeated and we are free.
And if Stalin was nothing like Napoleon the Pig, if he was a big-hearted sweetie whose only goal was to help the proletariat, then Orwell's book would be wrong. He would be telling lies.
Do any of you want to see Jones back?
No.
Good.
I just don't think calling something a fable is much of a defense against the charge of misinformation, especially when the fable is about something as important as the Holocaust. And that leads us to the more important point here, which is that, The Boy in the Striped Pajamas isn't a fable. Animal Farm is filled with pigs and horses and stuff. There's a sheep in the book. That's why it's a fable. Like, there's an allegorical element to it. But what is the allegory in The Boy in the Striped Pajamas? It takes place at a concentration camp. Its protagonist is the son of a Nazi commandant. Adolf Hitler makes an appearance in the book, as well as his partner Eva Braun. So if the novel is just a fable, then that's crazy, right? That's a crazy type fable. Still, I can't help but find John Boyne's defense here a bit interesting. He's almost saying to his readers, guys, just please read the book. I don't have any big thoughts about the Holocaust or World War II or the Nazis or whatever. It's just a fun book with a nice message about some sad boys. And look at them dance. Are you really gonna get mad at them? And to this I say, okay, let's talk about The Boy in the Striped Pajamas on its own terms. Do you see the distance between you and I right now? That's actually the appropriate amount of space. I'm supposed to be this far from you. So the first critique anybody would want to make of The Boy in the Striped Pajamas is that its protagonist, Bruno, is almost incomprehensibly stupid. The most obvious example of this is Bruno's refusal to say proper nouns. Like, he says the Fury instead of the Führer and Outwith instead of Auschwitz. It seems like Boyne thought this added to the novel's fable-like quality, made it seem more vague and abstract. But this effect doesn't really work because we all know what Bruno is talking about, and the characters are always correcting him. Who's the Fury? Asked Bruno. You're pronouncing it wrong, said Father, pronouncing it correctly for him. It's not called Outwith, Bruno's sister said. Why can't you pronounce it right? It is called Outwith, he protested. It's not, she insisted. So this doesn't feel so much like a fable as it does a boy who is painfully unaware of the world around him. He pronounces every other word fine, by the way. It's just words that have something to do with Nazi Germany that really mess him up for some reason. But even if we want to allow Boyne his fable explanation for Outwith, Bruno is just holistically very ignorant in ways that don't feel natural for a 9-year-old. Like, at one point, all the boys are talking about what their fathers do for a living. You know, my father's a teacher, my father's a chef, my father's a grocer. But Boyne writes, when they asked Bruno what his father did, he opened his mouth to tell them, then realized that he didn't know himself. All he could say was that his father was a man to watch, and that the Fury had big things in mind for him. Now, what does that mean? The Boy in the Striped Pajamas takes place roughly in 1943. Bruno likely wouldn't remember a time that Germany wasn't at war, and Nazi Germany was, of course, a very martial culture, quite oriented around engagement with military life. Now, I'm not saying that Bruno would necessarily be able to recite all of his father's duties, But why doesn't the word soldier come to mind? Why is that being treated like some nondescript and esoteric occupation? Wouldn't Bruno know about this? Wouldn't he have been taught to be proud of his father's position in the military? Or here's another example, the end of an interaction between Bruno and his father. Boyne writes, Bruno pushed his 2 feet together and shot his right arm into the air before clicking his 2 heels together and saying in as deep and clear a voice as possible, as much like his father's as he could manage, the words he said every time he left a soldier's presence. Heil Hitler, he said, which he presumed was another way of saying, well, goodbye for now, have a pleasant afternoon. Isn't that just baffling? Why is Bruno presuming things? Why is he mentally translating the phrase Heil Hitler, something he no doubt hears constantly, into something else? Are we to believe that this boy has no idea who Hitler is or why he's celebrated? It almost feels here like Bruno is an alien presence in the world of Nazi Germany, one who understands the basics of human interaction, but didn't grow up there and so never has a clue what's going on. So these choices are all very strange and silly, but I think what's going on here does kind of make sense from an aesthetic perspective. Because essentially, The Boy in the Striped Pajamas is selling itself not as historical fiction, but as dystopian literature. Think of Jonas from The Giver, a boy who starts off his novel thinking that his flat authoritarian world is normal. Think of Tally from Uglies, one of my favorite books/movies. She starts off her story excited to receive government-mandated sexy surgery.
You'll be beautiful and free.
These characters are oblivious. They don't see what could possibly be wrong with the world around them, and that lends these stories a feeling of suspense and excitement.
I guess I'm sort of terrified.
Precision of language.
And this is very much the feeling of The Boy in the Striped Pajamas, right? At base, it's a book about exotifying the Third Reich, treating it not as a place where real people lived, but as this kind of odd dystopia where everything just feels off. What is the fury? Where is Out With? Out with what? What does my father do? Who are these people off in the distance, and why are they wearing pajamas? Is the fence around them there to keep them in, or keep us out? It's so lurid and dramatic, and it feels like it's all headed toward this inevitable payoff, where the hero finally gets to understand what's going on, what this evil society is really all about. But here's the problem. That catharsis, that lifting of the veil, it's the one thing that this book can't give us. The Boy in the Striped Pajamas is a book that is written for its ending. A child totally ignorant to the Holocaust, who is naive, who just wants to make friends and go on adventures, is horribly punished, gassed by the Nazis. In the moment he dies, the reader can reflect on the arbitrary nature of evil, on the purpose of fences, on the reason we place boundaries between the self and the other. There was no real difference between Shmuel and Bruno, two boys with the same birthday who loved to play and love each other, but the world thought otherwise, and so they had to die. There is no place in this evil Nazi world for the innocence of a child. So I can see why this ending would be appealing to people. It has a kind of fun Twilight Zone character to it. It's brutal and intense, and in some sense poetically just. There's just one issue with it though. It completely breaks the story. See, The Boy in the Striped Pajamas wants to be about two things. First, a book about friendship. The novel reminds us quite frequently that Bruno and Shmuel talk all the time over the course of a full year, that they are best friends. The last words Bruno says before he dies are, "You're my best friend, Shmuel, my best friend for life." Second, it's a book about a boy who must remain so ignorant to the Holocaust that by the end, he willingly and without fear or trepidation jumps the fence into Auschwitz. And maybe when I put it like this, you can see the issue. These two stories can't really coexist. And that's because the more friendly Bruno gets with his Holocaust victim best friend, the less sense it makes that he doesn't know one single thing about the death camp he lives next to. In other words, if these two really are such good friends, why doesn't Bruno learn about Shmuel over the course of the novel? So this is a deep tension at the core of this book, right? The most central parts of its plot feel directly at odds with each other. So how does Boyne write around it? Well, by making the relationship between Bruno and Shmuel as shallow and meaningless as possible. Boyne constantly finds ways for Shmuel to not communicate his feelings and experiences, oftentimes in ways that are downright agonizing to read. Like, look at this one scene where Bruno sees that Shmuel has a black eye. Boyne writes, "One afternoon, Shmuel had a black eye, and when Bruno asked him about it, he just shook his head and said that he didn't want to talk about it. Bruno assumed that there were bullies all over the world, not just in schools in Berlin, and that one of them had done this to Shmuel." It's very convenient, isn't it, that Shmuel doesn't want to talk about the horrible things going on in his life, that Bruno doesn't have to hear about the Nazi guards who regularly brutalize the inhabitants of this camp. Because if Shmuel did want to talk about it, well, Bruno would probably be less inclined to think of Outwith as a good place that would be nice to visit. And you can see in this passage how the need to keep Bruno ignorant actively cuts against a feeling that Shmuel is a person, one we're supposed to care about and empathize with. Imagine you were in Shmuel's shoes. You're a child and you live in hell and you're hungry all the time and grown-ups sometimes assault you. Suddenly though, a boy your own age comes into your life and now he's your friend and he sometimes brings you food. Now just think about all of the emotions you'd feel. Can this person save me, save my family? If they bring food, can they bring more? Perhaps if you told this boy why you have a black eye, he'd do something, anything about it. There's a million interesting ways this interaction could have gone. It's a scene with a lot of potential. But in the novel, all of that has to be artificially tamped down. Bruno can't know what Shmuel is going through, and so Shmuel is not allowed to talk. Their friendship feels like nothing because the book structurally cannot give us more than that. What happened to your face? I don't want to talk about it. That's all we get. And this need to protect Bruno from information, even if it doesn't make practical or narrative sense, goes to way more absurd places. Like, let me read you a conversation between Shmuel and Bruno from a bit later on. The two boys looked down at the same time, and the difference was easy to see. Although Bruno was small for his age and certainly not fat, his hand appeared healthy and full of life. The veins weren't visible through the skin, the fingers weren't little more than dying twigs. Shmuel's hand, however, told a very different story. "How did it get like that?" he asked. "I don't know," said Shmuel. "It used to look more like yours, but I didn't notice it changing. Everyone on my side of the fence looks like this now." In this scene, we are expected to believe that Shmuel and Bruno, two 9-year-olds, are wholly unaware of the connection between not eating food and getting skinnier. Perhaps we could forgive this lapse of knowledge from Bruno, a child totally sheltered from the world and who seems all around quite dim, but why is it that Shmuel must be equally ignorant, must be forced to not know information that would be so obvious to him, as obvious as the connection between being strangled and gasping for air? He doesn't know why he's skinny? Yes, he does, or at least he would in any work of art that actually cared about him, about the things he experiences on a day-to-day basis. But because Bruno cannot be made to hear about the starvation of his friend must not be capable of understanding starvation. But here's the thing, even in the rare moments where Shmuel is able to talk more freely about his experiences in the camp, the text still finds strange ways for Bruno to not process what his friend says. Let me read one more scene here, another talk between the two boys. "I don't know why you're so anxious to come across here anyway," said Shmuel. "It's not very nice." "You haven't tried living in my house," said Bruno. "For one thing, it doesn't have 5 floors, only 3. How can anyone live in so small a place as that?" He'd forgotten Shmuel's story about the 11 people all living in the same room together before they had to come to Outwith. He forgot. He literally forgot. He just, he just forgot about it. And that makes sense, I guess, because if he'd remembered such a thing, he probably wouldn't want to go to Auschwitz himself. The Boy in the Striped Pajamas is a book that clearly wants to be about the transformative power of love. Bruno and Shmuel, two boys living opposite lives, come to love one another, and through that love come to understand and question the dystopian world around them. But that's a lie. There is no friendship here, no connection. Shmuel cannot meaningfully talk to Bruno, cannot meaningfully affect him, because if he did, the book couldn't have its contrived and insipid ending. And so we're left with this kind of hollow story. A boy who spends a full year, talking to a victim of the Holocaust who does not learn one single thing about it. But like, okay, from a certain perspective, isn't that kind of interesting? Okay, so John Boyne thinks this is a book about friendship, about, quote, two basically good-hearted and kind boys. We know this. He's been saying versions of it for almost 20 years now.
I always say it's a novel about friendship, more than I use the word Holocaust. It's the friendship between Bruno and Shmuel.
And if we take this interpretation to the novel, it is a colossal failure. But what if, I don't know, John Boyne is wrong? What if he completely misunderstands his own story and the characters he portrays? And what if, instead of worrying about what the book is trying to say, we worried about the things it actually says? Let me be direct here. I think The Boy in the Striped Pajamas is an interesting and rich book. At times, I even think it's quite good. But to understand it, I think we have to move away from the fiction that it's some kind of cutesy fable. So okay, let's jump in with one of the most interesting sequences of the entire book. Over the course of the novel, Bruno develops a relationship with a guy named Pavel, a Jewish man who works for the commandant's family, preparing vegetables and helping out around the house. In one scene, Pavel accidentally spills wine on the Nazi Lieutenant Kotler, and Kotler beats him to death. And this all happens right in front of Bruno. Jumping forward around 10 pages, and coincidentally, Shmuel makes an appearance at Bruno's house. He's there to polish crystal. Bruno offers Shmuel some chicken and greets him as a friend, but when Lieutenant Kotler finds them, this happens. It's kind of a long passage. "Have you been eating?" Kotler asked in a quiet voice, as if he could scarcely believe it himself. Shmuel shook his head. "You have been eating," insisted Kotler. "Did you steal something from that fridge?" Shmuel opened his mouth and closed it. He opened it again and tried to find words, but there were none. "Answer me," shouted Lieutenant Kotler. "Did you steal something from that fridge?" "No, sir, he gave it to me," said Shmuel, tears welling up in his eyes as he threw a sideways glance at Bruno. "He's my friend," he added. "What do you mean he's your friend?" Kotler asked. "Do you know this boy, Bruno? Have you seen him before? Have you talked to him? Why does he say he's your friend?" Bruno wished he could run away. He hated Lieutenant Kotler, but he was advancing on him now, and all Bruno could think of was the afternoon when he had seen him shooting a dog, and the evening when Pavel had made him so angry that he... "Tell me, Bruno," shouted Kotler, his face growing red. "I won't ask you a third time." "I've never spoken to him," said Bruno immediately. "I've never seen him before in my life. I don't know him." Lieutenant Kotler nodded and seemed satisfied with the answer. Very slowly, he turned his head back at Shmuel. "You will finish polishing all these glasses," said Lieutenant Kotler in a very quiet voice now, so quiet that Bruno almost couldn't hear him. "And then I will come to collect you and bring you back to the camp, where we will have a discussion about what happens to boys who steal. This is understood, yes?" This scene occurs around 3/4 of the way through the book, and it feels like a kind of breaking point for Bruno. The satisfying moment where his blindness to the Holocaust finally gives way to clarity. Bruno knows that he's not supposed to be friends with Shmuel, right? Otherwise he wouldn't have lied, gotten his friend into trouble. There's an implicit sense then that Bruno is at least somewhat aware of the power dynamics at hand, that he's not so ignorant. What's more, Bruno explicitly compares the way Kotler's acting with Bruno to the way he acted when he beat Pavel to death. The evening when Pavel made him so angry that he... So it certainly feels like Bruno is thinking what the reader is thinking. In the weeks that follow this scene, Shmuel is no longer at his usual spot behind the fence. Boyne writes, "Every afternoon that followed, Bruno returned to the place in the fence where they met, but Shmuel was never there. After almost a week, he was convinced that what he had done was so terrible that he would never be forgiven." And it makes sense that Bruno has that thought because he knows demonstrably that Nazis kill Jews sometimes. But then what does Bruno do with this knowledge? Nothing. Less than nothing. Here's what happens when the boys reunite. "Shmuel," Bruno said, running toward him and sitting down, almost crying with relief and regret. "I'm so sorry, Shmuel. I don't know why I did it. Say you'll forgive me." "It's all right," said Shmuel, looking up at him now. There was a lot of bruising on his face, and Bruno grimaced, and for a moment he forgot about his apology. "What happened to you?" he asked, and then didn't wait for an answer. "Was it your bicycle? Because that happened to me back in Berlin a couple of years ago. I fell off when I was going too fast and was black and blue for weeks. Does it hurt?" When John Boyne was asked why it is that Bruno doesn't know about the Holocaust, he responded, "The idea that Bruno, an innocent 9-year-old, would understand the events taking place around him implies the hindsight knowledge gained only by the passing of time and the study of history." But the thing is, this series of events doesn't read like innocence or confusion or even the stupidity of a 9-year-old, does it? No, it reads like denial. Bruno's outright refusal to deal with knowledge we know he possesses. Refusal to care about his friend. How did you get hurt, Shmuel? You fall off your bike? And the thing is, when you start to look for it, this sense of denial and apathy kind of pervades the text. Like, let me read you another passage, a conversation between Bruno and Shmuel. "There aren't any good soldiers," said Shmuel. "Of course there are," said Bruno. "Who?" "Well, Father, for one," said Bruno. "That's why he has such an impressive uniform and why everyone calls him Commandant and does whatever he says. The Fury has big things in mind for him because he's such a good soldier." "There aren't any good soldiers," repeated Shmuel. "Except Father," repeated Bruno, who was hoping that Shmuel wouldn't say that again because he didn't want to have to argue with him. Both boys stayed very quiet for a few minutes, neither one wanting to say anything he might regret. "You don't know what it's like here," said Shmuel eventually in a low voice, his words barely carrying across to Bruno. "You don't have any sisters, do you?" asked Bruno quickly, pretending he hadn't heard that because then he wouldn't have to answer. "No," said Shmuel, shaking his head. See, it's not complicated. Bruno is defensive of his Nazi father, and so he doesn't want to listen to his friend or process the things he says. Bruno, in this moment, is not naive. He is performing and protecting his own naivete. He knows his friend wants to convey information that might change the way he sees the world, and he straightforwardly says, "I don't want to think about it. Shut up. Everything is fine." Or just for one other example, let's jump forward to the end of the novel. So as you know, Bruno jumps over the concentration camp fence, but if you haven't read or don't remember the book, I genuinely think you'll find his motives pretty shocking. See, Shmuel's father recently went missing and he's desperate to find him. For this reason, Shmuel likes the idea of Bruno hopping the fence. He wants them to look for Papa together. And just before the boys pull off their concentration camp caper, we have this passage. "You still want to help me find Papa?" asked Shmuel, and Bruno nodded quickly. "Of course," he said, although finding Shmuel's Papa was not as important in his mind as the prospect of exploring the world on the other side of the camp. "I wouldn't let you down." When I read this passage, I literally gasped, because to me, it lays bare just how hollow Bruno is. His friend's father is gone, and he doesn't care because he just wants to go on some stupid adventure. And even though that's quite baffling, it also makes sense, right? Because Bruno is a character defined entirely by his own self-serving and paper-thin fantasy. It doesn't matter that his friend has a black eye or that the camps are a horrible place to live. He's not interested in what his father does or in why they moved to this place. He is fundamentally unshaken when he witnesses an elderly man beaten to death in front of him. The world to Bruno has no texture, and he seems almost hostile to those who would try to give it texture. You tell me you want to search for your presumably dead father, and that's fine for you, but I don't live in Auschwitz. I live in Outwith. Let me read you now one of the final passages in The Boy in the Striped Pajamas. Bruno has put on his inmate uniform, and he's about to jump the fence. "Do you know what this reminds me of?" asked Bruno, and Shmuel shook his head. "What?" he asked. "It reminds me of grandmother," he said. "You remember I told you about her, the one who died?" Shmuel nodded. "It reminds me of the plays she used to put on with Gretel and me," Bruno said, looking away from Shmuel as he remembered those days back in Berlin. "It reminds me of how she always had the right costume for me to wear. You wear the right outfit and you feel like the person you're pretending to be," she always told me. "I suppose that's what I'm doing now, isn't it? Pretending to be a person from the other side of the fence." "A Jew, you mean?" said Shmuel. "Yes," said Bruno, shifting on his feet a little uncomfortably. "That's right." This is going to come off as some contrarian hot take, I know that. But I legitimately find this passage dazzling, and that's because, despite John Boyne's intentions, it really conveys beautifully that this is a book about denialism, about the things we don't want to look at because they make us feel strange and complicit. Bruno gives his speech about how we are the costumes we wear, and it's clearly supposed to be the theme-stating moment for the novel. The differences between oppressor and oppressed is arbitrary and unjust and blah blah blah. But then Shmuel says, "You're talking about Jews, right? The treatment of Jews?" In this moment, it feels like Shmuel is asserting a kind of agency over the text, right? Like he's saying, no, we're not merely the costumes we put on, and the people on the other side of the fence aren't some abstract concept, the people in the striped pajamas. We're Jews, and we're in a death camp, and you could take off your costume, and you could go home. Upon hearing this, Bruno gets uncomfortable, and I just think that's so perfect. Such a great depiction of who he is and what he actually represents. In a sense, Bruno is correct. When you wear the right outfit, you do feel like the person you're pretending to be. He put on the costume of innocence and childlike wonder and blotted out everything else. And here, in the moment that costume finally comes off, his life is essentially over. There's nothing more for him to say. The book ends a few pages later. In the end, Bruno reminds me less of an empty-headed child and more of Brigitte Haas. Brigitte, like Bruno, was a child during the Second World War and moved to Auschwitz with her commandant father, Rudolf Haas. And like Bruno, she claims to have known nothing of the camps. I guess that's at least plausible in her case, though. Unlike Bruno, she did not spend a full year speaking through the fence to a young boy headed to the gas chambers. But Brigitte grew up and got old, and in 2021, she did an interview with journalist Thomas Harding, and I'll read you a passage. "Later, we found out what's going on," Brigitte said. "I don't really like to talk about it because I didn't like this idea, what they did, but I know it was not my dad's fault. I don't think he knew what he was getting into when he started because he was very unhappy many times, and when I talked with my mom after all this happened, she told me he was a very unhappy man. I pushed her on this," writes Harding. "How could her father be an absolute wonderful person if he was responsible for the murder of over 1 million women, men, and children?" "Well," she stammered, "that's a fact, isn't it?" I said. "Yeah," she conceded, "but I don't see it like this." "But it's true. You do agree it's true. You know it's true," I pushed. "Well, it happened," she said weakly. "It happened at Auschwitz," I said, to be clear. "Yes," she said, her voice barely audible. And this is what I think of when I read The Boy in the Striped Pajamas, an elderly child who knows and cannot stand knowing. The Boy in the Striped Pajamas movie, directed by Mark Herman, was released in 2008, and it seems to me that its central purpose is to tell the story that John Boyne felt he was telling, a sentimental fable about friendship in a broken world. In order to accomplish that project, though, a lot of the source material's rougher edges had to be sanded away. Watching Bruno ask the emaciated Shmuel why he's skinny, only for him to avow total ignorance of his own body, is moronic and contrived, and so that scene is just not included. Watching Shmuel tell Bruno that life isn't good in the camps, only for Bruno to pretend not to have heard him, is obviously uncomfortable and off-putting, and so the film doesn't force us to stomach it. Watching Bruno betray Shmuel, allow him to be wrongly punished by a Nazi who just murdered an elderly Jewish man, only to look at his friend's black eye and ask if he got it from falling off a bike, is profoundly dark, reflects poorly on our young protagonist. And so, that doesn't happen. In the movie, upon seeing the injured Shmuel, Bruno simply feels guilty. He never asks such an absurd and insulting question.
Shmuel, I'm really sorry for what I did. We are still friends, aren't we?
Watching Shmuel tell his friend that his father is missing and that he wants help finding him, only for Bruno to think, I don't care about your tragedy, I just want to go on an adventure. It's horrible, it skeeves you out. And so, in the movie, Bruno implies no such thing. In fact, he's very upset at Shmuel's loss and wants to help him as atonement for his past betrayal. And that's much kinder, isn't it?
I really want to make up for letting you down like I did. That would have done it, wouldn't it? Helping you find your dad.
All around, the film just makes more sense, feels more streamlined. I'm not trying to say that it doesn't have any of the same surreal quality as its source material. At one point, we learn that Bruno quite literally forgot his tutor's lesson on why Jews are bad.
They're in there because they're evil. They're the enemy.
The enemy? But I think we were fighting.
They're evil, Bruno. Evil, dangerous vermin. They're the reason we lost the Great War. Haven't you been listening to anything Herr List has been telling us?
No, not really.
And that's our Bruno, right? That's our little guy. But for the most part, the film is kind of breezy and unburdened. Compared to the book, Shmuel is even less of a prominent character. He says even less about his life in the camps, and his friendship with Bruno feels even more perfunctory somehow. Bruno, for his part, is not weighed down by grating and stupid narration. We don't have to hear about Outwith or the Fury. The movie is a light 90 minutes, and so the audience can think less, and that's a good thing. Even so, I hate The Boy in the Striped Pajamas movie. I hate its desperate desire to purge its source material of anything challenging or difficult, and ultimately, the film leaves me with a more bitter taste in my mouth than the novel ever could. So for the most part, the film stays true to its source material, but there is one pretty huge change: the newfound focus on Bruno's mother. In the novel, Bruno's mom is characterized pretty sparingly. She never wanted to go to Outwith, and she grows increasingly fed up with the whole thing over the course of the novel. At one point, she tries to convince Bruno's father that she should take the kids back to Berlin, and they have this interaction. "And what will people think," asked father, "if I permit you and the children to return to Berlin without me? They will ask questions about my commitment to the work here." "Work?" shouted mother. "You call this work?" So, while she doesn't seem to like living next to the Holocaust, it's not a point of emphasis, and we never really learn what she thinks of the final solution. In the film, though, it's a whole different story. Now, Bruno's mother seems to outright hate Nazi ideology. She doesn't like the things that Bruno is learning from his tutor, and she expresses that multiple times.
Does he usually teach children as young as Gretel and Bruno?
I believe so. Why?
Well, do we know what he's teaching them? Gretel seems to have become so...
They're being taught what all children are being taught at the moment. They mustn't get left behind. Come on.
What's more, for most of the film, she is totally ignorant to the nature of the death camps, and when she does discover the truth, she flips out.
How can you...
Because I'm a soldier. Soldiers fight wars.
That isn't war!
It's a part of it. It's a vital part of it. The fatherland we all desire, all of us, you included, cannot be achieved without work such as this. Elsa. Elsa.
Get away from me! Get away from me!
Toward the end, there's this one truly groan-worthy scene where we see her flopping on a tire swing, as though she's literally gone mad because of this knowledge. Bruno's family lives very close to Auschwitz. His mother would be able to see the smoke rising from the chimneys and hear the sounds coming from the camp and smell the smells of burning bodies. Even in Brigitte Haas's bleary-eyed and overly charitable vision of her childhood, she felt her mother knew the truth. I'm sure my mom knew what was going on in the camp. She was very sad about it, but she couldn't help. She just tried to be nice with the children and with my father. And that makes sense, because she was an adult in Nazi Germany who was married to the commandant of a death camp. And yet here, her analog swings from a tree branch, emptied out by the news. You can feel in this creative shift the film's desire to make everything clean and tidy. It's not that Bruno is foolish or ignorant or callous. No, we wouldn't want that. Instead, the entire world is blinkered to the Holocaust. Nobody can know anything because if they did, well, they'd lose their minds. I mean, nobody could actually accept the Holocaust, could they? In this way, the original book, this strange, difficult, and malevolent thing, is replaced with meaningless, overpuffed drivel, a film as hollow and false as the protagonist it wants us to love. Anyway, that's the end of the video, and I hope you guys really enjoyed it. I mean, I was a huge fan of making this one. This is one of my favorite videos I've made in quite a while, to be honest with you. I had so much fun drawing all the little pickies. I'm just here to sort of sit back and relax while the Patreon credits scroll by. Thank you to my patrons, but I just figured I would do some chit-chatting and just sort of reflect on life. And so one thing I didn't talk about in the video, because I thought it would just take too long and really distract from the whole point, is just how kind of odd John Boyne is sometimes. So like, whenever John Boyne talks about how he's canceled by the trans mob or whatever, he always makes it about his novel, his 2019 novel called My Brother's Name is Jessica.
It is probably the most empathetic book I've ever written. It's a book filled with kindness. But from the day it was published, it just became this touchstone for, to use your word, lunatics.
Now, I actually read My Brother's Name is Jessica, and while I'm sure there's things to take issue with about it, I thought it was fundamentally pretty okay, fundamentally pretty supportive of trans people, and certainly not the sort of thing that Team TERF, pro J.K. Rowling John Boyne would write in this day and age, 2025. And I find it so disingenuous that John Boyne always talks about the backlash to that book, because it seems like it intentionally obfuscates the things that he personally did to make sure that trans people would get mad at that book. 3 days before that novel was published, 3 days, he published that idiotic article about not wanting to be called cis, not thinking it was good to be called cis. And that article is like way stupid. Like, he doesn't even elaborate on what his issue is. Let me read you a little bit of this cis article. Just a sec. Can I just have a second, please? This is one of the only things he says about the concept of not wanting to be called cis in the whole article. While I wholeheartedly support the right of trans men and women and consider them courageous pioneers, already a bad sign in my view, considering trans people courageous pioneers, I actually think that's implicitly quite nasty, but I'm not going to dwell on that. It will probably make some unhappy to know that I reject the word cis, the term given by transgender people to their non-transgender brethren. I don't consider myself a cis man, I consider myself a man. For while I will happily employ any term that a person feels best defines them, whether that be transgender, non-binary, or gender fluid, I reject the notion that someone can force an unwanted term onto others. He doesn't even explain what his issue is with the word cis, like why that pisses him off. And then you go to another place where he's described what his problem is with cis, and let me read you a little bit more. We are being told consistently by everybody that we are all allowed to self-identify, right? No matter who you are. Why is that any different for me than anybody else? I don't see myself as a subset of men. I don't call myself a gay man. I don't call myself a white man. If I was to call myself a cis man, I am defining myself in opposition to transgender people. What, even? He doesn't call himself a gay man? I know that's not true. Like, I literally know that John Boyne does call himself a gay man.
As a gay man, my views on LGBT rights.
And I know that because how else exactly would I know that he's gay? How else would I figure it out? Is the idea that I would like stumble upon him kissing a little guy and be like, oh, so he's gay, but he never told me. You know, he's publicly a gay man. What are you talking about? Anyway, he releases this article about not wanting to be called cis 3 days before he releases his novel about trans people, as a little bit of a fuck you to his own writing. And then when people get mad at him and they're like, who the fuck is this guy? Why would I ever want to read something that this guy has to say about trans people? He's like, they're just mad at my novel and there's nothing controversial about it. You did this to yourself, John. Anyways, at the end, have the Patreon credits scrolled yet, or do I have to fill up a little more time? I'm gonna assume that'll do it. Bye. Yeah, I really hope you like this one. I really do.